Everything you've been told about surviving the London Blitz is a lie. While the history books focus on the bombs dropping from the sky, the real danger was sitting right on the dinner table. When the food supply vanished overnight, desperate citizens didn't just starve, they turned to a highly illegal underground recipe that the government actively tried to ban. Because if you ate this, you didn't just survive, you risked losing your mind. What would you do if your next meal could send you to prison, or worse, put you in the ground? In the autumn of 1940, the kitchens of London were not cozy places. They had become the front lines of a grinding, subterranean war of attrition. The Luftwaffe's bombs were falling with brutal rhythm, shattering windows that had to be covered with blackout curtain. But inside those shattered homes, the London housewife was facing an entirely different kind of terror. She was trying to put a meal together from the pathetic scraps allowed by the Ministry of Food. The air in these kitchens didn't smell like fresh baking. It was thick with the acrid scent of scorched root vegetables and the metallic, bloody tang of low-grade offal. Every single ounce of fat was treated like gold. Every tiny scrap of bone was saved as a potential base for a watery stew. Your ration book wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a talisman that drew the line between barely surviving and starving to death. By the time the Blitz really hit hard, the Ministry of Food, run by a businessman named Lord Woolton, had seized a complete monopoly over the British diet. This extreme state control happened because German U-boats were blockading the country, threatening to cut off the maritime lifelines that supplied a staggering 60% of the nation's food. Let's break down exactly how the rationing phases hit London like a series of slow-motion train crashes. The government didn't just rip the band-aid off, they slowly tightened the noose. On January 8, 1940, the first hammer fell. Bacon, ham, butter, and sugar were severely restricted, destroying culinary autonomy. The legal mechanism they used was brutal. You had to register, and your coupons were physically canceled upon purchase. Then, on March 11, 1940, the real pain started. Meat, specifically beef, mutton, and pork, was locked down, turning the classic Sunday roast into nothing more than a distant memory. And they didn't use weight to track this. They used value-based coupons. By July 1940, you couldn't even sit down for a decent cup of tea without the government watching, as tea, margarine, and cooking fats were restricted using a completely new points-based weight allowance. And then in August 1940, preserves like jam and marmalade were added to the monthly ration books. The psychological impact was massive because the government had effectively commoditized the caloric intake of every single person. The rationing system wasn't just a logistical nightmare, it was a heavy psychological burden. You couldn't just shop around. You were tied to one butcher, one grocer, and one baker through a strict registration system. This tied your literal survival to the honesty and the inventory of a single shop. It created a claustrophobic trap. If you argued with your retailer, you could lose out on the under-the-counter favors that were the only real way to get extra unrationed food. This shilling worth of meat became the ultimate metric of desperation. Because they rationed meat by value instead of weight, as prices skyrocketed due to the massive scarcity, the actual physical chunk of meat you got for your single coupon kept shrinking. By late 1940, the average person in London was allowed about 1 shilling and 2 pence worth of meat per week. That is barely enough for one tiny meal for a family. People were forced to eat variety meats like hearts, livers, and brains just to get by, because those were often unrationed but of highly questionable quality. But what happens when you can't even get the terrible quality brains and livers? What happens when a population is starving for protein? They turn to the shadows, and they turn to a terrifying underground supply chain that served up something so toxic the government had to form an undercover squad to stop it. We are going to look at the exact banned recipe people were eating, and I promise you it will make you look at your dinner differently tonight. In this massive void created by the extreme restrictions, a massive shadow economy exploded. We call it the black market, but it wasn't just one thing. It was a sprawling, chaotic network of illegal deals that ranged from petty under-the-counter favors to massive, organized criminal syndicates. At the center of all this chaos was the spiv. This word became totally synonymous with the wartime criminal who made made a living off diverting stolen goods. These guys operated in the bombed-out alleyways in the pitch-black corners of London. They offered everything you couldn't get legally, from silk stockings to prime cuts of steak that you would never see hanging in your local butcher's window. These criminals actually used the destruction of the Blitz to their advantage. They used the total blackout conditions and the wreckage of the air raids to move their stolen goods. One of their favorite tricks was completely insane. Thieves would dress up in air raid precautions warden helmets and armbands. They would walk right into shops that had just been blown apart by bombs. They pretended they were safeguarding the stock from looters. In reality, they were loading up vehicles, sometimes vehicles purposely disguised as ambulances, with whole sides of beef and massive crates of butter. All of that food vanished straight into the underground market. Meat was the biggest prize. The black market for meat was insanely profitable because people had a primal need for protein that the official rations simply could not meet. As the meat ration dropped in 1940, meat legging took over. The illegal supply chain wildly creative. First, you had direct diversion. Meat was straight up stolen from the London docks or hijacked right out of rail yards and sold to shady wholesalers. Then you had corrupt farming. Farmers sitting right outside London would conveniently fail to report that a pig had been born or a cow had been slaughtered. They would sell the extra meat directly to city contacts for 3 or 4 times the legal price. And then there were the counterfeit coupons. Stolen or forged ration books became literal underground currency. In one massive heist, 100,000 ration books were stolen directly from the Ministry of Food offices in Romford. That gave the black market enough fake legal tender to completely bypass the registration system. The scale of this was mind-blowing. In the US, they estimated 17% of meat went through the black market. But in the UK, where the scarcity was 100 times worse, that number was likely way higher, especially in the bombed-out center of London. If you were a London housewife, buying from the black market wasn't a luxury choice, it was a survival choice, and it came with a massive psychological toll. You knew your family's dinner was illegal. You knew that just one single neighbor reported you could end up in prison. This added a thick layer of paranoia to a life that was already heavily traumatized by the bombs falling every night. But the illegality wasn't the scariest part of the black market. The absolute most terrifying aspect was the food itself. When real beef and pork completely vanished from the black market, the meat leggers turned to substitutes, and these substitutes were frequently toxic or heavily diseased. People were so frantic for animal protein that the line between food fit for a human and straight-up waste completely disappeared. And this brings us to the banned recipe, the horse meat masquerade. This was the biggest, most prevalent deception in the 1940 London black market. Now, horse meat was culturally taboo in Britain, and because of that, it remained unrationed for a long time. This made it the perfect target. Black market butchers in London and Sheffield would take horse flesh, mince it up with tiny bits of pork fat and chemical flavorings, and sell it to desperate families as prime mince. But wait, it gets much worse. The danger wasn't just that it was horse meat. Legitimate horse meat meant for humans was super rare, so these black marketeers bought from knackers. Knackers were slaughterhouses meant strictly for animals that were heavily diseased, badly injured, or rotting. The government actively tried to stop this cat's meat from entering the human food supply. They mandated that this meat had to be dyed a bright, vibrant blue-green color. So what was the banned underground recipe? These shady traders would actually bleach the green, diseased meat with harsh industrial chemicals, or they would try to mask the blue-green rotting color with incredibly heavy, dark dyes and massive amounts of spices. They sold a product that was often completely fly-blown or literally riddled with bovine tuberculosis. And if eating bleached tubercular horse meat doesn't terrify you, the chemicals they used for preservation will, because the black market existed completely outside the reach of the Ministry of Food's health inspector. There were absolutely zero rules for preservatives. To keep rotting meat looking somewhat fresh on the shady stalls of the East End, these traders used a horrifying toxic cocktail of industrial chemical. It was a horrifying step backwards to the bad old days when meat was literally embalmed with formaldehyde, borax, and salicylic acid just to hide the putrid smell smell of rotting flesh. Let's talk about the specific industrial chemicals that the black market used to poison the public, because the medical realities are completely terrifying. They used formaldehyde to preserve decaying meat, literally embalming beef the way an undertaker embalms a corpse. If you ate this, you were looking at severe gastrointestinal poisoning, not to mention heavy carcinogenic effects that could kill you years later. Then there was borax or boric acid. They dumped this into rancid fats and butter just to mask the smell of rot. Consuming borax led to chronic kidney damage and complete metabolic disruption. How about salicylic acid? They used this to prevent cheap, adulterated fruit juices and fake jams from fermenting and exploding in the jar. Eating that gave you acute poisoning and severe respiratory distress. And maybe the weirdest one, paraffin wax. They used plain old candle wax as a bulking agent to make margarine and cooking fats look bigger. Human stomachs cannot digest paraffin wax. Eating it caused severe indigestibility and massive gastrointestinal blockages that could require emergency surgery. Surgery that you probably couldn't get because the hospitals were full of bombing victims. Imagine the sheer psychological weight of eating that. Londoners had to develop what was called a sensory defense. You had to sniff every single bite of food for the sharp scent of formaldehyde or the harsh ammonia-like smell of meat that had started to liquefy before being chemically resurrected. The stakes were literal life or death. A single meal bought from a shady butcher in Stepney could give you anything from agonizing stomach cramps to fatal arsenic poison. We're talking about worthless substitutes that were accidentally mixed with highly lethal industrial poisons. So the government had a choice: let the people eat poisoned horse meat or crack down hard. And they chose to crack down in a way that sounds like something straight out of a spy movie. We're talking undercover agents, entrapment, and a level of paranoia that completely destroyed neighborhoods. To fight back against this massive, toxic black market, the Ministry of Food turned itself into a ruthless enforcement machine. Lord Woolton put together a massive squad of over 900 inspectors. Their one mission was to infiltrate the kitchens and the small shops of London. And these guys weren't just looking at paperwork. They were actively running a state-sponsored entrapment system. By late 1940, the government started using undercover agents provocateurs. They often picked women who looked totally ordinary and unassuming to trick shopkeepers into breaking the law. Down in neighborhoods like Stepney and Hendon, these undercover agents would walk into a butcher's shop and actively try to buy meat without handing over the required coupons. One of their best moves was called the coupon switch. The agent would order a tiny amount of tea, and then right when the assistant was distracted, they would change the order to a much bigger amount. They were hoping the assistant would forget to cancel the extra coupons, catching them in the act. The newspapers hated this. The press called these tactics un-British, but the government did not care at all. Their goal was to create a massive wave of fear among the shopkeepers and the everyday consumers. Think about it. If any random stranger standing next to you in a line could be a secret government inspector, the trust completely vanishes. And trust is exactly what the black market needs to function. By destroying that trust, they forced the illegal trade deeper underground, straight into the hands of much more dangerous professional criminals. And if you got caught, the penalties were designed to completely ruin your life. The government knew that if the profit from selling illegal meat was bigger than the fine, people would just keep doing it. So they introduced Regulation 55. This law let people smash people with fines of up to £500, plus an extra penalty of 3 times the value of the goods they sold, and up to 2 whole years in prison. Let's look at some real case studies of the penalties that were handed down during the jurisprudence of scarcity. Down in Epsom High Street, a butcher was caught selling unauthorized cuts of meat and keeping unjust, rigged scales. He was slammed with a £27 fine plus court costs, which was a huge hit. In Stepney, a butcher was caught selling meat without coupons, and he was actually busted by an undercover agent named Isabella Tomset. He faced massive, heavy fines and the total closure of his business, but the insiders were the worst. In Brighton, an actual food enforcement officer, the guy supposed to be stopping the black market, was caught stealing 80,000 ration books. He was thrown in prison for 3 straight years. Even tiny crimes were punished with insane severity. Back at the Epsom Meat Center, a guy was caught stealing just 2 little tins of corned beef. The judge gave him 3 months of hard labor. And in Forest Row, someone was caught simply adding dirty water to their milk to stretch it out. They were hit with huge fines and subjected to literal public shaming. The politicians were completely rabid about this. Over in the House of Commons, MP Joseph Clines actually called the black market treason of the very worst kind. There were even people seriously demanding the return of the cat-nine-tails whip for anyone who made money off the starving public. In this insane legal environment, stealing one single tin of corned beef was treated like you were committing acts of sabotage. Every stolen calorie was viewed as a direct attack on the nation's life energy and its ability to fight off a German invasion. The psychological damage of the 1940 food crisis is almost impossible to fully grasp. For the average person in London, their own kitchen was a place of massive physical and ethical danger. The government was pumping out propaganda about fair shares, but the reality on the streets was completely different. Regular people watched the super rich eating off-ration meals and fancy West End hotels, while they were forced to choose between starving for a week or eating a plate of highly toxic bleached horse meat. And on top of all of that, there was the terrifying fear of literal Nazi sabotage. Secret MI5 reports from 1940 and 1941 show that the British government was incredibly anxious that German agents were going to poison the domestic food supply. When they interrogated captured German agent, they discovered real plans to poison the water with tablets that looked exactly like aspirin. They also found plans to use toxic powders to randomly dust the food in public communal kitchens. This fear of toxic warfare soaked straight into the London kitchen. If your topwater tasted a little metallic, or if your bread looked slightly discolored, you instantly thought it was a German plot to kill you. The government even painted the tops of the pillar boxes in the street with a special yellow paint that was supposed to turn red if there was poison gas in the air. It was a constant, horrifying visual reminder that the air you breathed and the food you ate could turn lethal in a split second. All of this completely shattered the social trust that usually holds neighborhoods together. You had to wait in lines for 4 or 5 hours just to get a single piece of fish or a tiny bag of onions. That time burden caused massive exhaustion and deep resentment. Working women who had to handle this absolute nightmare constantly fought with neighbors they suspected of jumping the line or getting secret favors from the local butcher. Your kitchen became a fortress of secrets. Families would literally hide the food they bought on the black market away from the windows. They were terrified that a neighbor would look inside, see a piece of meat, and report them to the local food control committee. The feeling of shared patriotic sacrifice was totally gone, replaced by a ruthless survival of the most cunning mindset. Knowing how to navigate the illegal, toxic food economy became a much more important survival skill than patriotism. Think about that for a second. Would you risk feeding your family something you knew might be toxic just because there was nothing else? Let me know in the comments if you think you could have survived this, because it gets even weirder. When people were terrified of the poisoned meat, the black market offered something else: worthless mimicry powders. These products showed just how incredibly inventive and how purely evil the wartime criminals really were. As real food vanished, the shoddy shops suddenly filled with weird powders and chemical mixtures that promised to taste like the food everyone missed. Take milk, for example. Real milk was heavily rationed, mainly saved for little kids and pregnant women. On the black market, you could buy milk substitutes for 5 shillings a pound, which was an absolutely insane amount of money back then. But what was it? It was nothing but flour, salt, and baking powder. It had zero nutritional value, and if you fed it to a baby, it could cause severe, life-threatening dehydration. Then you had the onion illusion. Onions were incredibly famous for being scarce during the Blitz. They were such a luxury that people actually raffled them off for charity events. So the black market created onion powders. They promised it would make your watery stew taste like a real roast, but when the government investigated, they found out these powders were literally just water and a smell. They were selling people basic sawdust or starch that was sprayed with a tiny microscopic drop of onion oil or fake artificial flavoring. And finally, the fake eggs. Later in the war, the government made legitimate dried egg powder, but the early black market versions were horrifying. They were dangerous mixtures of fake yellow dye mixed with whatever disgusting proteins they could find. We're talking about dried animal blood or fully ground up bone meal. Eating that carried a massive risk of catching salmonella and other brutal foodborne diseases. These deals weren't just simple scams. The stakes were the ultimate stakes. If a desperate family spent their very last pennies on a fake milk powder or a piece of dyed horse meat, they weren't just losing money. They were being robbed of the very calories they desperately needed to stay alive during the freezing, terrifying nights of the Blitz. Realizing that you had essentially poisoned yourself or your kids with a fake substitute just to survive the night was a huge shared trauma across London. It left people feeling completely helpless and furious at the black marketeers and furious at the government for completely failing to protect them. The statistical reality of this time period paints a horrifying picture. Let's compare the official government promises to the dark reality of the black market. Officially, the weekly meat allowance was supposed to be 1 shilling and 2 pence, which equated to about 450 grams of very low-grade beef, but on the black market, you could easily get over 2 kilograms of meat if you were willing to accept that it was horse meat or highly dangerous variety cuts. The government tried to enforce a price ceiling of 10 pence per pound, but the illicit street price ranged anywhere from 3 shillings and 6 pence all the way up to 5 shillings per pound. The Ministry of Food deployed their 900 inspectors, and they were prosecuting around 3,000 people successfully every single month. The government was constantly shouting fair shares propaganda to build social trust, but in reality, there was a 60% massive increase in neighbors reporting on their own neighbors. The official goal was to maintain public health with a diet of 1,680 calories, but the reality of surviving on the black market meant a massive high risk of catching tuberculosis or suffering from arsenic and formaldehyde poisoning. This entire crisis permanently shattered the British relationship with food. The extreme rationing and this horrifying shadow economy proved that when people are pushed to the absolute edge, morality goes right out the window. The Ministry of Food tried to control a national shortage with rigid rules, but they completely failed to understand the raw, physical desperation of people living under falling bombs. That desperation built a massive criminal empire that fed the city its own diseased, chemically altered waste, and people ate it because the alternative was starving to death in the dark. The shadow larder of 1940 is a chilling reminder of how fast society completely breaks down when scarcity and fear take over. So the next time someone talks about the heroic sacrifices of the home front, remember the shadow larder. Remember the people who had to bleach green, rotting horse meat just to feed their kids. Remember the undercover agents busting butchers over a few extra ounces of tea. And most importantly, remember that the most dangerous place in 1940s London wasn't necessarily the street during an air raid. It was sitting right down at the dinner table, staring at a plate of food that could either keep you alive for one more night or kill you before morning. If you found this trip into the dark side of history completely fascinating, you have to hit that like button and subscribe right now. I've got another crazy story lined up about the insane things people did to survive World War II. Click the video on your screen right now, and I'll see you over there.